Today's video is a response to Omegon's video titled, Attacking Men Has Consequences. If you don't know who Omegon is, he's an anti-feminist / Squidward fanboy. Do note that I've moved a segment he inserted as he starts to talk about his first case to after both cases, as it really broke the flow of my response, but I still wanted to respond to it later on. It's just him talking about what he sees these cases as demonstrating, so it really felt better to review his evidence and then his conclusions, rather than start the first piece, listen to his conclusion, then return to the first piece, and then go on to the final piece. But with that declared, let's get to it.
Before we get into the meat of today's video, I wanted to update everyone on what I was talking about in yesterday's video, where since that has happened, Boris Johnson and David Davis resigning, some vice chair aides have resigned and other people from cabinet positions, to the point where only Angela Merkel herself is praising Theresa May for making progress and that the deal is 80% done, because right now what we want to show unity are two of the weakest leaders in the Western world, i.e. Theresa May and Angela Merkel, praising each other, and I'm not joking. Angela Merkel or Angela Merkel, whichever way you want to pronounce it, is hanging on by a thread. She will not win her next term, that is a guarantee. For God's sake, how many coalitions did you have to form for this government? And Theresa May, if she pushes with this idea, is done. We know this, as much like everyone suspected, there were already letters submitting for a vote of no confidence. Not that I see that ending well just yet, for people that want her out that is, but give it time, I'm sure things will turn around.
Way to gloss over the existence of Donald Trump, who has Putin's hand so far up his arse that the scientific community is considering reclassifying Trump as a symbiont. I mean seriously? Fuck Theresa May, but at least she's not so spineless that she's allowed a superpower to turn into a puppet state. And that's just Russia. Look at the way that North Korea is walking all over Trump, promising to cut back on nuclear activity, before starting up new projects, knowing full well that Trump lacks any and all ability to put an end to it. As for Angela Merkel, yes, her ratings have hit an all-time low. Why? Coalition infighting. Not because she shows weakness, but because Merkel refuses to bend to the demands of Mr. Seehofer, leader of the Christian Social Union who wants to turn away refugees. So in standing firm with her party's principles whilst part of a coalition, she is apparently weak. I think you're confusing strength with popularity here. Fact is, the same dispute has hurt Seehofer and the CSU far more than it has hurt her. Beyond that, we could talk about the fact that she's often seen as the second strongest politician in the world, only second to Putin, i.e. the Emperor of America, so it seems that you're talking a load of bollocks here and little else. She sure as hell isn't perfect, but from a strength perspective, Trump is nothing but a soiled child by comparison, and what you're saying makes no sense at all.
Now the subject of today's video are from subjects that have actually cropped up in the past but have since been updated. For example, the police force are being asked to consider the case for monitoring sexist abuse. Now this all stems back to July of 2016, where Nottinghamshire police began to trial a scheme where wolf whistling would be considered misogyny, and by extension, a hate crime. Now I know what most of you think. What an absolute waste of money. It's wolf whistling. And these studies have been done multiple times, with a woman walking through a city and only being noticed or addressed in a somewhat misogynistic manner a couple of times over the many hours that she walked around New York City. And then you had a man, a very attractive man, and he was the victim. And I call him victim because if you're going to be consistent here, then of course it was sexist for them to then treat him like an object, the women that catcalled him. So if we're going to be consistent here, then surely we want to focus on both victims. As Henry Cavill himself has said, men can be victims of this. Not that I care too much for the idea of a victim from the offset. This is all quite frankly pointless and a waste of resources. There are things the police could actually be dealing with, and this is not on the list. It's not even in the top 100 things the police should be doing. So I hope I've made my point quite clear. Police chiefs are looking at recording misogyny as a hate crime, including incidents of men whistling at women. Include it the other way round and we can talk, although I will say whistling is quite cool. Forces are being asked to consider the case for monitoring sexist abuse and harassment. Well, if you're going to be consistent, the above statement needs to be reflective of both genders being the victim of the wolf whistling, as it does in fact happen. It means misogyny. How about just sexism, because misogyny is only one particular way, and if we're going to truly tackle sexism in all its forms, you have to accept that both men and women can be victims of sexism.
If by clear you mean you've repeated yourself over and over again, then sure. Beyond that, I'd have to ask you to back up what you're asserting. For a start, I'd settle for knowing what studies you were referencing, since you failed to link them below, and when I reached out to you on both Facebook and Twitter, you failed to return my messages. Now from the facts that you say, we see, I'm getting the impression that by studies you mean those edited and likely staged videos designed to go viral and not an actual study. If that is the case, then we have a problem. Moving on to the facts that men can be victims, nobody has said otherwise. But just because a man can be catcalled does not then mean that the impact this has is the same as on a woman. The problem with what you're doing here is you're taking a social interaction grounded in a very specific social context and attempting to rip it out of said context and pretend that the actions are the same. But that's not how social interaction works. A parent giving their child a bath is very different to, say, a complete stranger doing the same. Ultimately, both are the same action, but the difference in social context turns childcare into an arrestable offence. So how about we look at some of that context, starting with where many problems in the West have their roots. Christianity, which from the 4th century Common Era to the 16th century Common Era, reigned relatively unchallenged in Europe, and even then the challenge came from other forms of Christianity, such as the Protestant Reformation. Indeed, it wasn't until the 19th century that said disease began to be dispelled by the Enlightenment, and the fight continues 2 centuries later. The Bible not only lists women as property, but there are numerous accounts of God-fearing fathers offering their daughters for rape to spare male guests. Why? Well, because the rape of a man was an act of violence against the man himself, whilst the rape of a woman was a property crime against the father or husband of that woman. Indeed, this is why the Bible describes how if an unbetrothed woman is raped, the man has to pay the father compensation and then she is his for the rest of her life. And this principle of a woman being the father's property to the point of marriage and then passing on to her husband persisted. In legal terms, it was called coverture, the act in which a husband took complete legal control and ownership of not only their wife, but also any property she may have had at the time of their marriage. Coverture was not legally challenged in England until 1882, when finally a law was passed allowing some women to own property after marriage. Yet they themselves were still seen as property of the man until far more recently. It was only in the 1970s, after a massive push from feminism, that domestic abuse began to shift from being perceived as a private family matter to a public criminal one, and even to this day there are those who resist the notion that the courts have any right to intervene on behalf of the abused partner. But objectification also continues in other ways, such as media portrayal. Irving Goffman did a phenomenal study into the way in which advertisements are gendered, and though his framework was created at the very end of the 80s, it still holds up today with the ritualization of female subordination. But beyond advertisements, look at the way in which women are often used as background props in music videos and rewards in film. And whilst many films try to be subtle about it, some just right up don't care. The 2015 movie Pixels literally has a game trophy, won by the male protagonist, turned into a female game character to become the wife of one of them. A trophy wife, an object that has been won. And do note, there will always be exceptions to the norm, but whilst those exceptions may challenge, they in no way put an end to the norm. At least not immediately anyway. I'm stating this because I can tell I'm going to be hit with questions of, well, what about? These are observations of general trends, not natural laws set in stone. The problem isn't a single piece of media, much like the problem isn't a single act of wolf whistling or catcalling. The problem is it's part of a much wider social context, namely a context in which one demographic is attempting to maintain its oppression through routinely objectifying another. Remove that context and you do away with all forms of nuance, swapping it in for black and white. As for being a waste of money, again, that only has a chance of standing if you detach it from its context. You may see it as a waste of money since it impacts you in no way, but society is thankfully not made up of people like yourself.
We know this is the case because we still have systems in place that protect women and not men, that give women rights that men do not have, that make it so that men do not have access to services because they are always considered the perpetrator. Do I have to be any more obvious? If agreed, abuse directed at women could be treated more seriously than comparable crimes against men, and could even lead to tougher sentences in the courts. I'm going to leave that in. This is what most people have considered to be over years, to be women being treated as if they are a protected class. This reinforces it. This is also a contributing factor in what others call, and I have said it so many damn times, the sentencing gap. Quite frankly, this is not a deterrent. This is elitist. This is actually sexist. By the very definition of the thing you are trying to tackle, it is sexist. Because you have elevated women above men and treated men as less than human. You are denying them equal rights, and I would argue that anyone who is given a severe sentence compared to what a woman would receive then has a right to push for a motion to dismiss on the grounds of discrimination. Whether or not they are successful or not, I'm not entirely sure. But if you start to gender laws like this, you run a very serious risk. And I'm pretty sure most of you, my audience, would agree with me. And I know I've said this many times, but if you are a law person and now want to inject yourself in here, go right ahead. I'll just make it a point to ignore your comment once I realise there's a level of snark in it. I do read the comments after all. Nottinghamshire Police began trialling the scheme in 2016 and were followed by a handful of other forces. Now recording misogyny as a hate crime could be rolled out across all 43 forces in England and Wales, with a spokesperson saying police forces in England and Wales annually monitor 5 strands of hate crime. Police chiefs will be presented with a paper and asks them to consider the case for monitoring gender-based hate crime in the same way, only if it is absolutely equal monitoring and not exclusively looking for men as the perpetrator. There are instances we have seen with helplines that intentionally label men as the perpetrator, even though the service should be available to them as victim. Hell, last week in PMQs, an MP stood up and actually said 1 in 4 women are victims of domestic violence and 1 in 4 men are victims of domestic violence. That is the first time I've ever heard it ever recognised that men are equally the victims of domestic violence in the United Kingdom, and I'm going to play this clip now.
Domestic abuse is an act of brutality, often hidden in plain sight, and it affects 1 in 4 women and 1 in 4 men across this country.
Because it is quite important, recognising something that is absolutely abhorrent, and understanding and accepting that men are victims as well, because if you noticed, there was no laughter when men were mentioned as victims. That is a first. The only other times I've heard domestic violence mentioned were when SNP members stood up and asked questions, but explicitly mentioned women only as the victim. And this is important. This is one of those cases where you must accept both genders can be affected by this. Notice I said gender, not sex, because I've yet to see any legitimate statistics on non-binary victims of domestic violence. Anyway, the article continues on talking about women's centres and the End Violence Against Women Coalition, and pointing out that in forces that record misogyny as a hate crime, culprits are investigated and specially trained officers offer support to the victim. Fantastic. Now what about sexism as a whole? Just saying, I think this is one of those cases where you have to accept and address it as a whole, and perhaps correlate it and base it on statistics that show, and perhaps maybe instead outlaw whistling. Maybe do that. Have it replaced with a vuvuzela if you really want to get that girl's attention that she has one slamming hot booty.
If this is the first time you've heard male victims of domestic violence being discussed and taken seriously in public conversation, may I make a suggestion? Attend some feminist meets at universities around the UK. My uni's Feminist Society at the University of Surrey held multiple lectures on male victims of rape and domestic abuse, and they were never treated with anything less than the utmost sincerity and respect. The same can be seen for various campaigns I've helped promote on this channel, such as the Mankind Initiative, which ran such a helpline, and Padlock, which was a documentary on the topic. Note that even on a channel run by 2 feminists who are openly feminist with content warnings and everything, our viewers did not descend to attack either project. It's almost like it's not feminism that's putting down male victims. So what could it be? Well, could it be toxic masculinity that tells men that to be a victim is to be womanlike and that to be womanlike is to be weak? Could it be that when young men are raped, it's grown-ass men who make remarks such as, "lucky boy" and "where were these teachers when I was at school"? Could it be that seeking help for mental health is routinely mocked as people being hypersensitive snowflakes or too easily triggered? Why don't you actually read the personal accounts of men who failed to come forward, because they're very telling in why. Meanwhile, if you want to blame feminism, then you need to show that connection and nothing less. Moving on to the differences in law, let's get one thing clear. Men do not have less rights than women, but women are a protected class, as you mentioned, so how can that be? Well, all a protected class consists of is a demographic which, whilst may be equal on paper, is still facing discrimination, drawing back to that social context discussed earlier. Protected classes exist not as a form of elitism, but necessity. You're the guy crying discrimination because the fire team isn't spraying your house with water because it's not on fire. Oddly enough, simply clapping your hands and claiming everyone is equal doesn't resolve millennia of gender-based ownership and centuries of continuous objectification ever since. Yes, men suffer, but they don't suffer because they are men and women are oppressing them. There's such a thing as crime against an individual versus crimes against a demographic, as is the basis for all hate crime legislation. The only time men suffer as a result of being men is as collateral damage caused by patriarchal narratives such as toxic masculinity. And it is feminism that is tackling this head on, and tackling gender-based discrimination is not gender-based discrimination in itself. That's like saying confiscating stolen goods to give it back to the owner is theft. Moving on to the differences in services, yes, they do exist. But again, why? Now this one is in part due to the early psychological models of abuse, which did assume men were always the aggressor. The irony here being that even though certain forms of early feminism did have a hand in this, the idea itself is founded in patriarchal notions of strength and power being masculine by default. Pretty much the old model was only men could be violent because women were weak. The new model, meanwhile, is anyone can be violent, yet men have some degree of societal support and even training in said abuses, linking back to the wider social context. But this was in no way the only reason. Women have unified under feminism to build the structures these services were founded upon. Men have not done the same, at least not to the same scale. For as many men like to throw out male domestic abuse as an argument, next to none of them seem interested in actually helping said victims. Now if that was what the men's right movement had been, I'm almost certain that the majority of feminists wouldn't have batted an eyelid. But it wasn't. It's a group of people who only use domestic violence against men along with rape and suicide as a stick to try and whack feminism. That's the problem here. Now, I know this is a lot to take in, but if you're coming to this topic expecting easy answers, you're likely in the wrong field of work.
The second article I wanted to cover was again something that had cropped up a few years ago, but has since resurfaced. The article title, A Curfew for Men? What a great idea! And that's not even sarcasm. Imagine my shock. Thank you, Melinda Houston.
Melinda Houston is a comedy writer. I didn't know this before I watched her video, I just like to do a Google search to see what sort of work said person has done besides what I'm reviewing. Now this isn't a comedy piece, but it does read as a political parody, and I think that's why she chose to use some of the language she did. For example, at one point it states, quote, "Under the new regime, any men out after dark would have to be accompanied by a responsible female," end quote. Regime isn't typically used when one's being serious about their propositions. The article also concludes with, quote, "And I know now the idea is out there, and given the passion of our political leaders for law and order and keeping us all safe, draft legislation can't be far away," end quote, which once again screams satire since the article's very existence is about the government's failure to protect women. Just keep this in mind with how Omegon is going to present it.
So, Gretel, oh my god, that's actually a name, Lamont's recent letter in these pages, no men allowed out after dark. What a totally awesome idea. I have quite generally been racking my brain as to what we can realistically do to ensure women's safety after dark. It's possible I missed a speech quotation thing and just carried on with it.
Well, to better understand the setup for this piece, I not only tracked down the letter by Gretel Lamont, but also the letter she was responding to, written by David Brown and published in The Age on the 7th of July 2018. Starting with Brown's initial letter titled The Discussion We Need, it reads as, quote, "Newspapers have run much commentary which rightly condemned David Layerholm's comments about Sarah Hanson-Young. However, little has been said about the legislation. A call for the government to relax restriction on pepper spray, mace and tasers, that was being debated at the time. This was a missed opportunity as there is little in the media about how women can protect themselves from physical and sexual assault. Any discussion is usually shut down as victim blaming. To Senator Hanson-Young's credit, she does not believe that the measures in the bill will lead to women being safer. However, why can't we talk about risk minimization strategies such as not walking alone late at night? This is about living in an imperfect world, not attributing blame. Is this discussion really such an affront to the ideological positions of movements supporting women?" End quote. The very next day, letter writer Gretel Lamont responded in the same section with her piece titled Night Curfews, which stated, quote, "David Brown suggests not walking alone at night would minimize risk. I assume his suggestion is for women. Don't blame the victim. However, another idea is for no men to be out at night, or perhaps a curfew to prevent anyone from being on the street after dark." End quote. So we have a man parroting the tired advice that every woman has heard 1,000 times before as if it's some long-lost secret that's not been uttered for millennia, only to have a woman use his ambiguous sentence, "However, why can't we talk about risk minimization strategies, such as not walking alone at night, to offer 2 alternatives to said tired advice? Now, I don't think Lamont is actually forwarding a curfew, but it's as valid, if not more so, than the current notion. As for Brown's complaint that he can't repeat the same old crap without being called out for victim blaming, that's what said narrative has become part of. In the same way that the defense will attack the victim on every and any basis ranging from how much they've had to drink, their marital status, their religious conviction, and so on, this narrative has been used to try and absolve the man of their actions. Welcome to the wider social context of this statement. Women shouldn't go out alone is at its best a form of thoughts and prayers used to convince people that they're helping and parroting what everyone already knows, whilst at worst it's used to shift responsibility for rape from the rapist and onto the victim like they deserved it in going out alone. And this was something that Melinda Houston would go on to state, yet you failed to read, with quote, "As females, once we're out and about after dark, post-peak hour, we know we're in potential danger. So let's shift the burden back to the blokes, who certainly could be at large after curfew if they chose, but would know they're at constant risk of being caught and spending the night in lockup, which in the scheme of things still isn't as bad as the risk of being raped and murdered." End quote. Either way, I'd advise my viewers to go and read the original article before continuing, as Omegon cuts out massive chunks after the first few paragraphs, taking little snippets and completely removing their context and then going, why don't they talk about this, when they do.
Demanding safe passage at all hours, regardless of where we are, what we're wearing, or our blood alcohol level is all very well, but that is never going to happen no matter how much education there is. There is always going to be random evil dudes out there. Yes, there is. What's your point?
Didn't the usage of evil dudes in capitals even merit consideration that this was satire? Like, if I read said article and saw that, the last thing I'd conclude was that they were being super serious. The article is written like your typical women need to take responsibility section, but the focus has been flipped, something both Lamont and Houston are pretty open about.
So how do we shift responsibility of women's safety from the victims to the perpetrators? I don't know, stick bromine in their tea? Although I would say that the responsibility is to both people, to obey the law. For women, of course, you want to stay safe, and of course at the same time you don't want to have to then go out of your way to protect yourself because you shouldn't have to do that. I agree. I totally agree. Much like those evil dickheads that then rape poor innocent people on the way home. Men and women, I might add, but mostly women, of course. The statistics do in fact show this. We need to be able to understand why these men do this, why they're so opportunistic, and why they think they can get away with committing a truly heinous crime, and why we have yet to have a guillotine introduced just for those people, for their cocks. I mean, if they're so willing to stick it in something without consent, then surely they won't mind sliding it into a guillotine. I'm kidding, I'm not encouraging violence here. I maintain if you're convicted of rape and it's 100% proven, you, male or female, belong in a jail for the rest of your life. I'm not convinced rehabilitation will help you. And certainly there are studies that would conclude that rehabilitation doesn't work on certain crimes.
It needs to be said, this shit is not helpful. Joking about the extremely violent things you'd like to do to the rapist detracts from the actual conversation and the issues it was designed to highlight. It's a move that's meant to do nothing more than virtue signal, and yes, I'm using that term because it actually fits here in that you don't agree with rape. You are effectively devaluing the conversation simply to promote yourself. You can take issue with rape without needing to insert joke about genital mutilation again and again, because you're going to do it again, to waste time. Also, once again you mentioned studies, but the only references in your video description was a Daily Fail article on the first story, something that is hardly surprising, but considering you actually complain about the rich in your video, I didn't think I'd find you reading such a stooge rag. The second was of course the article we're discussing currently. No studies, however, just assertion of studies, which is actually worse than not mentioning studies at all. Why? Well, because when you don't mention studies, people kind of know it's just your opinion and nothing more. In saying studies, you're trying to give off the impression of intellect and research, which you lack.
Adding her bit to the debate, and in response to the suggestion from yet another letter writer that women shouldn't walk alone at night, which I disagree with, Miss Lamont came up with perhaps the most practical and efficient solution yet. A curfew on men. Genius! I think to guarantee absolutely no one suffers, I believe in a curfew on everyone. What, is that unpopular? I'm kidding, I don't actually believe this. I don't for a second think anyone should have a curfew unless they've broken the law and it is imposed upon them by a court, or you are a child and your parents do not wish for you to be out past a certain time. That said, the idea of putting a curfew on men means that then businesses suffer. That is true. We know this.
Well, the counter here would be that more women would be able to go out on their own at night. So that comeback doesn't work. But it must really suck to be so lazy that in not checking the original letter by Lamont, you actually ended up making the exact same suggestion as her. Remember that she stated, quote, "However, another idea is for no men to be out at night, or perhaps a curfew to prevent anyone being on the streets after dark." End quote. Again, this was said in the counter to the previous letter, and I get that it likely makes you angry. Good, that's what it is meant to do. When men parrot, well, don't go out alone at night, they don't realise just how much that it impacts their life. That's until you flip the demand and tell them, well, how about you lot don't go out at night instead? That's the very purpose of this satire. It's designed to get people with an empathy block to think about what they're actually saying. Thanks for being a sport and showing us that it worked amazingly on the first part. Shame that you seem unable to figure out its satire.
And I will not now be going into the vastly complex understanding of why some people commit those crimes. The simple solution is because they're a cunt. We all know that. But as we all know, there are many different scenarios that play out that lead to that idiot committing that crime, which is why that idiot, regardless of intoxication or culture, religion, belong in a jail for a very long time, preferably with their genitals removed, male or female. Remember the woman from last week who forced her boyfriend to, quote, have sex with her? Yeah. Castrate her.
Well, colour me shocked at the fact that you won't go into detail. Next, you'll be telling me that you like to mention studies and never actually reference any. Don't get me wrong, if you don't need a study, then don't use one. But if you're going to say, and we know this because studies have shown it, you better be supplying them studies. Also, just stop with the genital mutilation crap. You don't answer a crime with a breach of human rights, and I know you're probably going to say, oh, I was just joking, but you're still detracting from the conversation. There's also another issue of what you say here and how you seem to be pretending like ignorance breeds rape. You keep calling these people stupid opportunists, which seems to be a failed attempt at othering them. I say failed because of the ignorance displayed in your video. But the point is you seem to be working pretty hard to portray rapists as these others born out of ignorance, rather than people such as yourself born out of entitlement. Power, not ignorance, is the root of rape. I mean, the topic of campus rape sort of drives a bus right through your pretense otherwise.
Now let's hear the genius reasons as to this curfew on men. There are a number of options. One is to simply ban all men from being on the streets or on public transport after, say, 9:30 p.m, which is effectively the restriction currently placed on women, self-imposed, and of course entirely based on the inability of the police to tackle certain crimes and make it such a fear factor for those who intend to commit a crime that they are unwilling to commit crimes, for example, in cities. We know this as the crime rate in London is astronomical and the police are pathetic. They're too busy chasing misogyny. I'm kidding, they're not busy chasing misogyny. They're too busy mimicking their American friends and eating donuts. And you think I'm joking? They are, because they're fucking useless. Oh, and omitting evidence, not fully investigating, and generally not doing their job properly.
You keep saying, and we know this, as if that's meant to actually mean something, but it doesn't. Fact is, what you showed us was not the reason for the article, and I noticed that earlier with what Houston said in how women have heard this platitude thrown at them time and time again as if it actually achieves something. But there's another thing I noticed here, namely the switch in how you presented the article. At first you presented a simple screenshot of the part you were quoting. Okay, nothing out of the ordinary there, nothing was removed or added, etc. But when it comes to this part, you remove the text either side. Now why is this? Whilst it's possible that this is just some personal quirk, I find it slightly disconcerting that the very sentence above the one you just read out was a caption quoting the part about the regime, i.e., quote, under the new regime, any men out after dark would have to be accompanied by a responsible female, end quote. And I can't help but wonder if this was omitted specifically because it suggests very strongly that the article is a satirical parody of what women hear all the time. I can't tell for certain, of course, but there's a strong possibility of that being the case.
Of course, in our country we have our own issues with the police investigating rape and believing word verbatim what someone has said, and then compiling the evidence and withholding some of it to the point where it has been found on the final day, and the truly innocent person, the original perpetrator, is found to be not guilty, and I hope they sue you into the ground. Anyway, the remainder of the article gives a bunch of scenarios and replacements to encourage men to not be on the streets so women have a safe journey home. As I've stated, this is entirely based on cities. This does not take into account rural or suburban areas and different cultural changes, because let's face it, even my country, which is the size of the average American backyard, has several different cultures and subcultures within it. Hundreds of cultures, different views and perceptions on how society should run. I would not for a second want to be out late in London, not just because of the knife crime. And I say London loosely because London is vast, and there are so many different cultures within it. There are some I would not go through during the day, and that's just Westminster, because then I'd see all those corrupt oiks. You know, the politicians. If you don't know what an oik is, please Google it. It's appropriate. Anyway, all this sexist nonsense is doing my head in, so I'm going to end this now.
Really? You're expecting what is very clearly a piece of satire designed to parody the useless advice thrown at women as if it had merit and as if they were lacking common sense, to have every aspect of their, not actually their position, sorted out. Also, where is the sexism in flipping the narrative thrown at women back on men to demonstrate how useless it is? In all, this was a very sloppy piece of work. Fact is, as mentioned earlier, I cut a part out of your video from the start because you interjected it as you talked about the first case and it needed addressing, but really broke the flow. So I'm going to show that now as it relates to the title of the video, which, reminder for the audience, was titled, Attacking Men Has Consequences.
But in any case, we have two articles from two different things that have come up, and I want to address both in this video, because I think this all falls under the bracket of, let's just attack men because, which will all lead to an inevitable. If you keep pushing men, alienating men, taking away powers and rights from men, making them feel like they are the perpetrator at all costs, eventually there is a pushback, and the pushback is always the one you don't want. It is not a threat. To be clear, I do not condone violence, but I know eventually, when you push someone hard enough, they either absolutely surrender, or they fight. So it's flight or fight, although flight in this instance will be accompanied by a white flag. Although moving away entirely actually is not such a bad idea either. I guess there are three options. Flight, fight, be French. That works. Flight, fight, French. I like that.
Just because you say it's not a threat does not stop it from being such. Now there's a big difference between a well-intended warning and a dishonest portrayal of what's occurring designed to stifle criticism, and I've become a bit of an expert in which is which. I've seen this exact behaviour before, you see, with religious moderates using the threat of violence carried out by fundamentalists as a way to try and halt criticism of a belief system as a whole. I got the same chill that I get when I hear Muslim preachers warn ex-Muslims that if they continue to, quote, attack Muslims, what happens can only be expected. But here's the thing, neither ex-Muslims nor feminists are, quote, attacking either Muslims or men. Ex-Muslims are critiquing Islam, a religious belief system, and feminists are critiquing patriarchy, a social institution of systematic oppression. Fun fact, a vast number of cis men don't feel, quote, attacked when harassment is made a more severe crime, because they don't make a habit of harassing women. Nor do they take offense when a parody of common garbage advice is produced, flipping what women have been told for decades back onto men, because they take the time to understand where the writer is coming from and have an empathetic capacity beyond that of a common potato. Now you also threw in the myth that rape cases are assumed to be true. This garbage, as with the rest of the stuff you note with zero basis, doesn't really merit response beyond noting its existence, only in the minds of the truly and willfully ignorant. Returning to the main topic, however, we know that those who benefit from a system of oppression likely won't give up without a fight. History is written in the blood of those who fought and died in the process of making a better world. So what's the purpose of throwing this out there outside of using it as a threat to try and get us to back down? That's right, there isn't one. We know criticizing men sometimes has deadly consequences, but what does that tell you about the way in which women are treated, if they are willing to risk it? Hi there, I'd just like to say a few things here at the end of the video before you go. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who's ever donated to the channel via Patreon, giving a special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, John Schoenrock, Daniel Martinez, and Alexander Williams. Your support has ensured this channel's ability to grow over the years. I'd also like to ask that you comment down below and like this video, as well as subscribe, hit the bell icon, and follow Essence of Thought on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Please also consider following Atheist Alliance International on Facebook, a humanist organisation dedicated to helping atheists around the globe. Any comments utilising language which insults others on the basis of perceived gender, sexuality, ethnicity or ability both mental and physical will be removed immediately, and the commenter may be blocked on the moderator's discretion. Let's work to keep the space one which upholds the values of humanism. Thank you.